It's good to be here, and it's been a very interesting discussion so far. I am going to use a PowerPoint because I want to take you to a part of the world that many of you may not be very familiar with. So hopefully that's now working. I've been researching the Belt and Road Initiative and looking at risks in relation to a number of different areas, the financial institutions, the digital Silk Road, and in particular, I'll discuss today the ports and pipelines, road and rail infrastructure. And I'm trying to move the slide, but it's not working for me. Just a moment, sorry. I may have to go. Oh, the slide is frozen, I think. Ah, there we are. Okay, you can see the next one. This is a map of the one representation anyway of the Belt and Road Initiative. The infrastructure projects that are underway across the developing world as part of this Belt and Road Initiative create new trade routes and global value chains that, if they are successfully implemented, will perhaps replicate the successful East Asian development model across the rest, potentially, of the developing world, modelled on how countries such as Japan, Korea, Singapore, and of course China at the largest scale have been transformed in recent decades through attraction of foreign investment, export orientation, and their integration into global supply chains. And Southeast Asia and South Asia are particularly important to this Belt and Road strategy of China's. They're key economies with which China seeks greater economic integration, and as the regions with the greatest potential for further growth and trade development, they have potential to benefit most strongly from such integration. As neighbours of China, they're also, however, acutely aware of potential costs. Within China and across much of the developing world, the Belt and Road Initiative is presented as China's contribution to the next phase of globalisation, building new infrastructure connectivity to drive development, trade and people-to-people links, all of course with China as the hub. In the US and in much of the West, the response of course has been very pessimistic to this, with the Belt and Road seen as a giant geopolitical game to trap nations in debt, to export opaque business practices, to exploit local communities and to wreak havoc on the environment. In short, the expectation of the West is that China is doing essentially what previous rising powers did, except perhaps without gunships and without conquest. Although some geopolitical observers expect China will, in future, militarise its overseas assets, just as former powers did, which is what makes Myanmar such an interesting, particularly critical case. So here's a map. Myanmar, which was formerly known as Burma, is a nation of 60 million people. So it's about the size of France, just to put that into some context. And of course, it's beside the two biggest countries in the world by population. So it's located here at the juncture of South Asia and Southeast Asia, wedged between India and China, but it also borders Bangladesh, another huge country in population, Laos and Thailand. It was formerly colonised as part of the British Empire, and Myanmar became independent in 1948. But despite being resource rich, it suffered under long-term isolationist authoritarian regimes that failed to develop the economy or to stabilise deep ethno-nationalist-based conflicts on the nation's periphery. It began a partial democratisation process in the last decade, and there have been two elections, the most recent being just last month, and the overwhelming popular vote has been, of course, for Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy, although the military retains 25% control of the parliament and key institutions in Myanmar. So it makes the country a hybrid authoritarian democratic experiment. In recent years, Myanmar has pursued international economic integration, just like its neighbours, and it has attracted investment from other Asian economies, but it remains isolated from Western economies because of its poor human rights record, in particular in relation to the terrible plight of about 1 million Rohingya people who have fled violence and dispossession in the Rakhine state to seek safety in neighbouring Bangladesh. Go to the next slide here, and Myanmar presents, I think, multiple paradoxes, but in particular 3 that I'll discuss today. First, it's a nation seeking to stabilise and modernise, but it remains racked by internal conflict. So it's a nation without internal security, and therefore we might expect it to be vulnerable, in particular more vulnerable than others to external threats. And so that's an important question for us to bear in mind when we think about the Belt and Road Initiative. Second, it's seeking development. Indeed, it's surrounded by successful development models in East Asia, but it has been so far unable to emulate the success of its neighbours. That doesn't mean that an elite has not become wealthy and powerful, but any broadly distributed benefits from economic development, as we've seen in other East Asian countries, has not really happened yet in Myanmar. And third, Myanmar must manage an asymmetric relationship with its major economic partner and the major, of course, emerging power of the world, and that is China right next door. Myanmar needs to benefit from China's economy, but at the same time, obviously needs to resist domination. The China-Myanmar economic corridor is a key component of the Belt and Road Initiative. It involves a port, pipelines, rail and other infrastructure to connect Yunnan province in southwest China with Myanmar and through Myanmar to the Indian Ocean. The Jiapu port and special economic zone promises a strategically important new supply route that avoids the choke point of the Malacca Strait through which China's westward maritime trade must currently navigate. The recent United States economic coercion against China, the so-called trade war, underlines for Chinese the security threat that China believes it faces should the US decide in future to go even further and potentially to close off the Malacca Strait to Chinese shipping. The strategic importance of Myanmar, therefore, offering an alternative to the Malacca problem, leads on the one hand to geopolitical fears in the West that the new port planned for Jiapu and the rail, road and pipeline routes to China will come under increasing Chinese influence and potential militarization in the future. In other words, Chinese control. The Myanmar government and business elites see development opportunities on the one hand from cooperating with China, while in the community in Myanmar there's deep suspicion of China, and this is based on a history of previous incursions from China into Myanmar, distrust of Chinese businesses which are feared will not benefit local communities, and also concerns about environmental protection. There's also an internal security dimension, as the Jiapu Port and Special Economic Zone project is located in the troubled Rakhine state on the western coast. So can Chinese finance and investment and Myanmar aid Myanmar? Can it help Myanmar in stabilising, modernising, developing and managing its relationship with its giant neighbour, or does it threaten Myanmar's internal security, offer limited economic benefits while granting potential geopolitical control to China? Or are there alternative scenarios somewhere in between these opportunities and threats? Despite its poor governance with constrained capacity, Myanmar has actually demonstrated significant degrees of agency in its negotiations with Chinese actors. The previous government suspended a huge project, the Nyitsoni Dam project, in the face of public protests. And the first National League for Democracy government renegotiated a greater share of control over the Jiapu Port project, although it remains dominated by Chinese firms, and it reduced the cost of the project down from more than $7 billion to just over $1 billion in the first phase. It's also seeking, the Myanmar government is also seeking to implement learnings from other cases of foreign finance and investment from other countries. So the story is a little bit complicated. So in my research, taking a political risk approach, I'm investigating how actors, stakeholders and experts on the ground in Myanmar assess their options and likely courses of action in response to a spectrum of risks. This is a distinctly empirical and multidisciplinary approach, contrasted with traditional approaches of international relations that might seek to explain things according to how things might happen in the rest of the world. But I'm specifically looking at how do Myanmar people see their situation. The political risk approach identifies problems with negative consequences, but it seeks to understand them not according to theory, but in context, including how such risks are perceived and may or may not be managed in practice. So by collecting rich contextual information from actors, stakeholders and local experts, I'm seeking to answer this research question: how can the political risks of the Jaipu port be identified, analysed and assessed? Must Myanmar submit to control, or does it retain degrees of freedom to manage risks and to realise economic opportunities from the Belt and Road? The preliminary results of the research indicate that there is a wider spectrum of risks and therefore more complexity than otherwise might be conveyed in the international narratives on the Belt and Road. In short, it is complicated. And my field research, unfortunately, has been a bit stalled this year, of course, because of COVID-19, but 2 rounds of interviews have been conducted. 1 round of interviews was held in Myanmar this time last year, and the photos in this PowerPoint are from last year. And the 2nd round has been conducted online, together with obviously a literature survey, although there's not a lot of literature really that's informed locally from Myanmar. Most of the literature tends to be written in Washington or in other places and making grand assumptions rather than being based on evidence on the ground. So that's my attempt to try and look at how stakeholders on the ground see things. So this has got a lot of information in it, which is why I thought I'd just present it as a slide while I talk. A major risk factor for Myanmar is the wide gap between the practices of government and business elites that engage with China for economic development and the popular fear of China amplified in the all-pervasive social media in the country. Facebook is all-powerful in Myanmar, as we found with the crisis in the Rakhine state, where the ethno-nationalist violence was really driven by Facebook and by a whole lot of fake news generated, and which Facebook was really was responsible for generating. And it's only later that Facebook has admitted its culpability in that horror story of what happened in the Rakhine state. A fundamental question for Myanmar is whether the opportunity of improved trade connectivity from the Jaipu project may also enable future militarisation of the port. Now, this may not seem likely today, but it may become a threat in a deteriorating geopolitical environment in which China in the future may have strengthened its military projection capabilities. Another key question is whether project management in constructing the port and its economic corridor to China will be aligned with Myanmar's goals, with their national development goals, and whether it will deliver positive economic, social and environmental outcomes. And this, of course, is in the hands of the government, but it's a government with really constrained capabilities. Nevertheless, as we have noted, Myanmar has demonstrated both a willingness and a capability to negotiate and to proactively shape conditions in agreements, but a countervailing culture lacking transparency, characterised by corruption, mean that the potential here for debt blowout and for a poor return on investment, at least for the broader set of Myanmar stakeholders, remains a concern. Yet if from dependency comes control, Myanmar has been actively diversifying its economic cooperation. Jaipu Port and Special Economic Zone is balanced by Tilua, another zone that's closer to Yangon that's been developed with Japanese investment and aid. And there are other economic zones and other investments from other major investors as well, from other Asian investors. However, even if China does not dominate the investment, or at least for now, or if it doesn't militarise the Jaipu port for now, it does have long-standing involvement with actors in Myanmar's border conflict zones. And so China's ability to exert influence to either build peace or to undermine peace is very significant. The role of China in peacemaking in the Rakhine state warrants, I think, further research to assess its likely contribution to the success or the failure of the Jiapu project over time. Ultimately, Myanmar faces a dilemma with the Belt and Road economic corridor that might be characterised as a binary between freedom and control, but which is actually a more complex challenge of ensuring domestic capability to manage risks and to pursue international balancing and hedging with other international partners, regional and international organisations, all of which raises much bigger questions that we can answer in such a short discussion. Nevertheless, my research aims to develop a framework to try and put these scenarios into some perspective. So this attempts to understand the risks that must be managed by Myanmar on the Belt and Road. It's very much a draft, it's very tentative, it's still under development. So, but it's proposed here to position these risks between opportunities and threats and within scenarios along a spectrum from freedom to control. In the best case scenario here, which I've called freedom, the Myanmar government in this best case scenario demonstrates capable and stable governance, delivering measurable and sustainable outcomes from the Jiapu project for economic and social development in the Rakhine state and with broader spillover effects for Myanmar as a whole. Sadly, we might assess this scenario as unlikely, given the capability constraints on Myanmar's governance, the deep problems in the region. But nevertheless, strategies should be developed with this scenario as the goal, would be my suggestion. The feared worst case scenario, on the other hand, which I've called control, would include Chinese militarization of Jiapu if the region and the world was in a position of geopolitical confrontation or conflict. Such conditions would be likely to arise, obviously, if the US-China relationship or if the China-India relationship continued to deteriorate into that point where the regional and global system of international cooperation that is currently functioning, I would argue, if it starts to move into dysfunction, then that becomes a realist risk. We might also tentatively assess, I think, this scenario at this point as unlikely, given the current constraints on China's geopolitical power projection. It's not as powerful as having that ability to totally disrupt the region at this point. The US is still by far the hegemonic power in the region. And of course, even if China was to try, the likely responses, not just from the US, but from other major powers in the region, which would be sufficient to prevent China from doing such a thing at this point in time. But of course, the region remains in this uneasy balance of rival powers. So in practice, the opportunities, risks and threats exist in degrees along a continuum between these best case and worst case scenarios. They're contested. That's why I've called the middle scenario contested. Myanmar may exert more power than observers expect, as indeed it has demonstrated, I think, in the evidence. But on the other hand, Chinese smart power in agenda setting and its growing hard power to coerce or simply to fund, simply to pay for outcomes that it wants, is of course expected to grow over time as China continues to rise. So proportionate risk management strategies must therefore be flexible enough to respond to movement along this opportunity risk threat continuum. So far, Myanmar has actually proceeded slowly and cautiously in its cooperation with the Belt and Road Initiative. While China's economic power is growing, Myanmar will benefit from its growing integration with other regional economies as well through its membership of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and its recent inclusion in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the world's biggest free trade agreement just signed a few weeks ago, which includes China, all of the ASEAN 10, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Only an improvement, though, in Myanmar's human rights record, in particular in the Rakhine State, would generate some more strategic options for Myanmar to engage with the US and with Europe to help attract a wider range of investors and to hedge against its giant neighbour. Ultimately, some critical external conditions remain outside Myanmar's control, from the state of China-India relations and, of course, the global geopolitical contest between China and the United States, which underlines, I think, the importance of focusing on the risks that can be managed in order to be better positioned when faced with those risks that cannot be managed. There are, I think, some useful lessons from Myanmar, in particular that even a poor and conflict-wrapped state like this can demonstrate some agency. Even in such a problematical case, actors do indeed have a wide range of options, and risks across a spectrum can be managed, except, of course, in worst-case scenarios, in which case control is probably ceded. Myanmar remembers ceding control to the British Empire in the past, and it will always fear the same again. The case of Myanmar, I think, demonstrates that there's value in investigating the complexity on the ground to understand the options that developing countries have to navigate the opportunities, risks, and the threats of rising China. So that's the end of my comments, and I'm happy to have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for your presentation. It appears we have 3 questions, so I'll get started with those. Our first one is from Dhananjay, who asks, where do you think the United States Lower Mekong Initiative stands in comparison to China's Belt and Road Initiative in Myanmar?
Yes, well, there are a couple of competing initiatives here. So the US has this initiative to work with the countries on the Lower Mekong, and China, of course, has its initiative to work with the countries of the Mekong as well. And so this is a good example of where the geopolitical contest is playing out in many respects. China has been damming the Mekong in many places, and there are huge concerns in the neighbouring countries as you come down the river system about the environmental and social impacts of those dams. China, on the other hand, is well aware of those concerns and is well aware of the very anti-China sentiment that has developed in these countries, that actually has arguably always been there in these countries throughout history, but it's being revived again as China rises. And so China, in its Mekong engagement strategies with governments and with elites, is very actively looking for ways to present itself as being a responsible leader in the region. But China's much better at working with elites and with governments than it is with the general public. And the US, on the other hand, has really fumbled its relationships with some of the governments and elites of Asia, but on the other hand, of course, has worked very closely with the governments that are most hostile to China, such as Vietnam. The US, ironically, today is very friendly with Vietnam, and using that friendship to drive a geopolitical agenda in the region. US is there for these geopolitical purposes, though, so it means that it's really complex for stakeholders and for elites to take the US too seriously in these questions, although the general public will tend to, of course, trust the US more, the general public throughout Southeast Asia, and will tend to have a higher level of trust because the US has much more soft power from its cultural impact in the world. And of course, as we've heard in previous presentations, it's a more attractive model as a theoretical model. Although I think, to be fair, the countries of Asia are much more realistic than that and don't expect to be copying anyone's models, but to be finding their own solutions. So I think that's the big challenge along the whole system here, is that you've got serious social, environmental, and economic problems. You've got seriously poorly governed countries with high levels of authoritarianism and corruption, state capture, and you've got this China rising and playing a large role in that, and scaring people. And you've got the US coming back into the region after largely ignoring the region for a long time, with a geopolitical agenda at play, simply trying to play an anti-China agenda, which at the end of the day is not going to win it strong support amongst those who wield power. And my final remark is just to go back to that point I made about the regional comprehensive economic partnership. At the end of the day, this region of the world, which is now the most important economic driver of the world's economy, and of course has the largest population in the world as well, has now engaged with a number of norms and standards through its active involvement in driving globalization. And so East Asia, through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, has demonstrated it wants free trade, it wants international trade law to be applied. Now, the US has been very actively working against the World Trade Organization and the rule of law in the trade law sense in recent years. There will be a great opportunity now with a change of government in the US to see if the US changes that approach. China, on the other hand, pretends to work within the system, and its rhetoric is extremely successful in the region because it's such an economic power and has driven such economic growth in the region, and it talks the talk of the rule of law in trade. Now, whether it actually always abides by that, we know very well it doesn't. So lots of double standards, lots of complicated issues there.
Thank you for that response. A follow-up question by John and Jay is, what do you think about India-funded projects like the Swifty port? Can India sway Myanmar away from China given its historical and cultural roots? Or does India value Myanmar as a strategic partner to counter China in both South and Southeast Asia?
Yeah, well, this is a very good question as well, and it raises similar questions because India also has tended not to engage very closely with Myanmar for quite a long time. And look, there are very good reasons for this on the Myanmar side too. I mean, Myanmar had an appalling, closed system for a long time, and China engaged with that system and in many ways propped it up, whereas India probably saw no benefit for quite some time in engaging with Myanmar. But now that Myanmar is in this democratization process, flawed as it is and full of problems, but even so, it has engaged in a process and has just had a very successful election, despite the fact that a large number of people were disenfranchised based on their ethnicity. But generally speaking, it was a well-run election, and so India as a democracy and as a country that also has, like the US, has a geopolitical agenda because it is a rival of China. It would be very much in India's interests to continue improving its engagement with Myanmar, and it has started to do that in recent years. And it also, Myanmar has offered to India as well to develop this port access up into the states of India that are landlocked and that are cut off from the Indian Ocean. And so not only will China develop the Jiapu port, but it's highly likely, I think, that India also will develop a port on the coast of Myanmar. And so this is a very clever balancing strategy on the part of Myanmar to engage with India as well as China, as well as Japan, and as well as Korea and other countries. So this is, I think, this is where the story of Myanmar that is told in the broad literature that you read, that as I remarked, might be written in Washington or Brussels or other places, is often very simplistic, but actually on the ground there's a lot more going on, a lot more thinking going on about how to manage the risks. It's not simply a black and white question, and it's not simply a question of China, because yes, India is a major player.
All right, thank you. And our last question actually comes from the Facebook Live video. How can the Rohingya crisis influence the politics in Myanmar?
the Rohingya situation is just tragic, and just as the similar problems of human rights abuse against Muslim groupings in Xinjiang and in Kashmir in India as well. I mean, this is a problematical part of the world for Muslim populations. It's a part of the world where there tends to be a racial, ethno-nationalist view that is populist, whether that be India, whether that be China, whether that be Myanmar. I would characterise it as a similar problem, that the overwhelming majority population has an ethno-nationalist concept of its national identity. Myanmar is constructed by the majority group as being a country that is Buddhist and that belongs to the Buddhists, and therefore all kinds of appalling violence and dispossession of people has been justified on the basis of an ethno-national identity. And you can see this problem in other countries, and indeed we see it all around the world. I mean, and we've seen it all around the world in history. So there's nothing unique about this, but there is something uniquely tragic about the scale of what happened in the Rakhine State. We are talking about such huge numbers of people, and of course there's been discussion in the International Court about describing what happened as genocide, and you know, as we outsiders try to grapple with the horrors of some of these issues, the question is the right question to ask. What does this mean in domestic politics? How does Myanmar resolve this problem? Because it is Myanmar's problem. It's the world's problem because it's a human rights disaster, but it's Myanmar's problem, and Myanmar has to find some political solution to this. But it's a really problematical one when the populist feeling is that a particular minority group doesn't belong, when they're seen as invisible, when the media and particularly Facebook allows people's views to be expressed that these people have no right to exist, then you end up in this tragic situation. And while this is a problem for Myanmar, it is a problem for all of us to think about. I think that you know, we're in a position in the world where there is a massive polarization going on. There's a very simplistic concept about what nation states are. We've had a golden period perhaps in recent times when we operation, but if we're closing borders and if we're going back to bunkering down into our own ethnic groups, well then we're going to see more of this sort of tragedy, not less.